Yeah, so the first question I had was, and you can kind of take this whatever way you'd like. How do you see your role as an artist in relationship with God?
With with
With
God?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, well, that's a very big question. I
it
mean,
is.
I think it's really important to me to know that I'm a created being, that I'm a creature, that I am a work of somebody else's authorship in that sense.
Mhm, mhm.
And I see my life itself as a kind of poem which God is still in the process of making, and which I'm cooperating and collaborating with him on. But it follows from that, of course, that I'm made in the image of a maker. And as Tolkien says in the Mythopoeia poem, we make still by the laws by which we're made, that there's something. So I see my own creative faculties, such as they are. I put the word creative in inverted commas for a reason. I see those as some part of the image of God in me.
Mhm.
And I see myself in that sense as fulfilling the kind of person I'm meant to be in, giving God pleasure by my writing. Um, but the reason why I put the word creative in inverted commas is simply that the kind and quality of God's creation is radically different from our own, in that God creates everything ex nihilo. We have to receive something before we can create. And in fact, all our so-called, I mean, I very much dislike the word original,
Yeah.
in the sense of striving for originality. Nothing is original in the sense that we didn't originate anything. God originated everything. But I inherit a language, which is the work of hundreds of thousands of anonymous poets making words, which are all metaphors.
Mhm.
And then I receive a poetic tradition from which I've widely read. And then specifically within that poetic tradition, I receive the Arthurian tradition.
Yeah.
And I'm working within that. I'm involved in a kind of long conversation. I'm taking up a tale that's been passed to me. And in my little proem, my little prelude poem to the whole Arthuriad,
Mhm.
I talk about how I expect somebody else to take the tale up from me. I'm not claiming
Mhm.
anything exclusive or definitive
Mhm.
about. In fact, both words exclude the words. I would ban both words exclusive
Mhm.
and definitive
Mhm.
from any sense of what creative writing is. It's never exclusive, and it's always part of a tradition, independent, and it's never definitive. There is always more to be unraveled and said and opened out. And so, yeah. But in that sense, I see my vocation as a writer as, in some sense, genuinely a vocation, a calling to be this kind of person and make this kind of work by the God who made me.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. So I wanted to ask, and actually, and Maya wanted me to ask more about your background in Canada. So yeah, understanding that you were born in Nigeria, and then your family at some point moved to Ontario when you were still a child. But yeah, how old
Yeah.
were you when you came to Canada?
So we
As
were in Nigeria, and then we were in Zimbabwe, and then we kind of left there rather hurriedly, and we ended up briefly in Cambridge. But
Yeah.
my dad got a job in Canada at McMaster University in '67. So
Okay.
we just, of course, the centenary year of Canada. We sailed over. We went over on a ship, and we sailed up the St. Lawrence Seaway and arrived in Montreal in the summer of '67. So I
Yeah.
was 9 going on 10, because I was born in '57.
Yeah.
And so we were there at Expo '67, which was amazing. And then we finally made it to Hamilton, which I
Yeah.
have to say is a bit different from Montreal.
Yeah.
And so from '67 through to '71,
Uh-huh.
so from 10 till about 14,
Yeah.
I just lived in Hamilton all the time. I went to a regular grade school and then junior high, and was sort of becoming Canadian. And I had lots of, Canadian friends. And by the time I become a sort of teenager, or certainly by the time I was about 12, I was really starting to listen to the music that was around, and the music that my older sister, so a lot of which was, of course, great and Canadian. So I was listening to Leonard Cohen and Neil Young and Joni Mitchell and all of that. Bob Dylan, obviously, the band.
Yeah.
But when I was 14, my dad, I was going on 14. My dad, I would have been about to go into high school,
Hmm.
but my dad was really not impressed by the standard in the Canadian schools. Mind you, I mean, that's not quite fair on Canada, because he was an absolute perfectionist and he wouldn't have been impressed by the standard anyway, you know, unless he'd been personally teaching. But he had a rather romantic idea that all the British schools were better. And he decided that also that we were losing our British identity, which again was another slightly ironic thing because we'd hardly ever been in Britain.
Mm.
But so in 71, he sent me and my sister over to England, and I began life as a schoolboy in a very selective, very academic school, mainly a day school in North London, but had a small boarding house. So I became an English boarding school boy, you know, with a uniform and everything. You all had to, you know, really strict rules everywhere. And you had an enormous trunk list. You know, you couldn't arrive on the school with less than 11 pairs of socks and 18, you know, carefully labeled handkerchiefs, and you know they were in dormitory inspection, all that kind of thing. It was not in the least congenial to me. I was very homesick and I didn't particularly like it. But the great thing was that I really began to discover poetry, written poetry. I'd always had spoken poetry from my mother, but I discovered you know, Keats and Shelley and the great romantics, and then through them I sort of eventually discovered everybody else. And it turned out that I was good at English. In fact, I couldn't believe that English was a subject, because reading and writing was what I did for pleasure. You know, the idea you could do that at school and get away with calling it work was amazing to me. So it was a competitive school. It was keen to get kids into Oxford or Cambridge. I was seen as a candidate who was capable of that. So all this time, right through the rest of the 70s when I was growing up, I had this kind of strange double life. So during term time, I was an English public school boy, public meaning private in a funny English way, you know, very buttoned up and deep into literature. And then I sort of transformed on the plane, kind of mid-Atlantic, and I became a Canadian teenager, kind of going to folk concerts and hanging out with my other long-haired friends and grooving on down to Neil Young, you know. So it was a kind of weird, you know, weird double life, but I like both sides of it. And then I did my final A levels in 77, and then they saw me as an Oxbridge candidate. In those days, you had to sit after all the exams you'd taken, you had to sit a separate entrance exam if you wanted to go to either Oxford or Cambridge, because it wasn't good enough just to have A's in your, you know, it was very selective. And you would stay at school an extra term to do that, which I did in the autumn term of 77. And happily, I won a scholarship, which was, you know, I mean, you know, it was a very small number of scholarships available. So I was extremely fortunate. And it was clear that I'd found my métier, as it were. So I got a place at Cambridge, and that sort of more or less that and the discovery of real ale made me think, because it would have been an open question: am I Canadian or am I British?
Yeah.
I think the combination of decent beer and an ancient university, which could have enjoyed together, made me realize I was British. I still, through 78, 79, I still went back to Canada in the summers. 80, when I was graduating, in fact, my parents came over for a year. My dad had a sabbatical. So that was 79 was probably the last summer I had in Canada, until happily I started going back there because I was touring with the Canadian singer-songwriter Steve Bell, and that's been, and of course going to Linlathen with you know, with Kirsten.
Yeah, that was
So
amazing.
that's a bit of my Canadian background.
Yeah. Sort of partly to follow up on that, I wanted to ask about any favorite Canadian authors or poets, either from then or discovered since.
Yeah, well, that's a really good. So when I was still in grade school and junior high, and a bit afterwards, one of the authors that we read, they were kind of in the school library, which I thought were really, really good, was by a writer called Farley Mowat.
Oh yeah.
And Farley Mowat wrote these wonderful stories set in the maritime provinces in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, often about the schooners that traded and the fishermen. And I always loved the sea and ships, so I really loved those Farley Mowat books. And then, of course, Leonard Cohen I was listening to as a songwriter, but I soon realized he was a poet, and I bought his poetry books as well.
Yeah.
So that was, but I'd say the main Canadian influence, in my mid to late teens was more musical than literary. But the music, I mean, but it was literary in its own way, because I was thinking Joni Mitchell is a great poet,
Mm.
and now by the time I was in Canada, they'd already just left. They'd all gone down to
Yeah.
Los Angeles and were in kind of the canyons of Los Angeles. But if you like, the place, Southern Ontario, Hamilton and Toronto particularly, was sort of burnished by their passage and still warm. So you could still go to folk gigs and folk cafes and things like that, in the early 70s, where everybody remembered the
Mm.
last time Neil played here or Joni played here.
Mm.
And then through Dylan, I got into the band. And of course, apart from Lee Von Helm, the drummer,
Mm.
Robbie Robertson and Rick Danko and Garth Hudson and all the others of them, they were all Canadian. They were all from Ontario, actually, more or less. So that kept the Canadian thing going. And then, of course, really happily in Cambridge, I met in 2011, I think, I met Steve Bell,
Oh,
who's a Canadian
yeah.
singer-songwriter, Award winner. And we kind of became mutual fans. I really loved his singing and his songwriting, and he liked my poetry. And we've had a long, rich collaboration ever since, which has brought me over to Canada several times, which I've been very pleased about. And then the other Canadian thing that happened was that probably about 10 years ago, maybe, I started getting invitations from Regent College to
Yeah.
come and, because they were really building up a kind of strength in theology and the arts. And I was their theology and literature person, really. So, and eventually they gave me the great honor of delivering these big set piece 3 public lectures called the Lang Lectures, which, Marilyn Robinson had done and Ian McGilchrist and people like that. So it was a great honor. And out of that came my book, Lifting the Veil. So I'm very grateful to that. That's another Canadian
Yeah.
adventure.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's amazing. I'm sad that we keep losing our artists, that so many of them get taken away to the States or elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great things about Steve Bell
Yeah.
is he
Yeah.
was there in Winnipeg, and Neil was in Winnipeg, but he left, and I think all those other Canadian bands, like 10 years after, and I can't remember, but Buckman Tenor Overdrive and all of that, they kind of all sort of disappeared, but Steve has stayed, and of course he's a kind of national treasure now, and
Yeah.
particularly sort of a Manitoba treasure. He always plays these big gigs in the Manitoba Centennial Hall with the Manitoba Orchestra with him and everything. I've taken part in those. They're amazing.
Yeah. That does sound amazing. I saw him not too long ago because he was down for Little Laughlin this year at Kirsten's. Uh,
Steve was there, was he?
yeah. Yeah. Steve was.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, I'm glad that connection's happened. I mean, he's brilliant. I think he's a
Yeah.
really good man as well, and very, very thoughtful. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And so and while when I was last at Kirsten's, I was just house sitting, taking care of the farm for a bit. She gave me she lent me all of the Arthurian books from her library
All right.
to catch up on.
Yeah, well,
Which
I've sent Kirsten a lot of, if not all of, the Galahad cycle, and she's been reading, I think, sometimes to her nephews as we're kind of road testing it to see if it appeals to a wider age range and so on. So all the reports back on that are good. She's very
yeah,
encouraging. Yeah.
that she had it all. And then she wasn't sure who she was allowed to share it with, but yeah, she told me that she had that complete. I was
Yeah.
really um Yeah, so I could turn to my more Arthurian questions. I'm yeah, getting very excited about the upcoming, as especially the more as I get into these stories. So yeah, I wondered if you could talk about what it means that that these stories are the matter of Britain. Um,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love the phrase "the matter of Britain."
yeah,
It's a medieval phrase, so it goes back to the idea that poets weren't supposed to be thinking up original things. They were supposed to be
mm,
retelling in the most beautiful way possible to their own audience the
yeah,
great stories that the world has bequeathed us.
mm,
And in terms of great epic stories, they were considered by the High Middle Ages. There was a consideration that there were 3 matters, as they called them, or subjects. Subject matter
mm,
just means subject matter. So the first, of course, and prime in a sense, this is excluding the Bible. Obviously, that was a separate thing, its own sacred space. But among the stories of the world, the first was the matter of Troy. And that included, obviously, the Iliad, the Trojan Wars, the Odyssey, because that's a return from Troy of Odysseus. And by extension, then, from Homer to Virgil, it included the Aeneid. And lots of other writers, none of whom are remembered now, tried to write about the matter of Troy, but it was kind of, and I mean, obviously, Troilus and Cressida is set in that, and Chaucer's Troilus, has Trojan scenes. So that was a thing. Then there'd been the extraordinary, both historical but very soon quasi-mythical figure of Charlemagne, Charles the Great, in France, and Charlemagne and Roland and all of that. And so there was a whole, and that was the kind of, a kind of epic scenario of its own. And that was known as the matter of Gaul, Gaul, Gaul as in, France. But the third matter, which was was held in equally high respect, and in some ways, in the High Middle Ages, eclipsed the matter of Troy and the matter of Gaul, and that was the matter of Britain. And the matter of Britain meant the entire set of stories, some of which were from Brittany, some of which were from Wales, which were gathered together and given their first really public British and European outing in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regnum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain. But very soon, mainly writers in Europe fell in love with it. It was the kind of the 13th century, the 12th and 13th century, where this stuff finally gets out. Obviously, it's about somebody who purportedly lived 600 years earlier than that in Wales, but of course they didn't have that sense. So they described Arthur as though he too were a kind of 13th century king. There was a huge kind of passion for that beautiful, glorious heraldic life, which was deliberately imitated in the courts. So if you go on into even to the 15th century, I've just been doing some work looking at the Battle of Agincourt, which of course Shakespeare celebrates in Henry V. And half the French knights are called Lancelot and Galahad, and actual knights in actual courts in the 13th and 14th century read the stories of King Arthur and went, great, I'm going to be a knight, I'm going to have a squire, we're going to have big tournaments, we're going to have courtly love, which of course is a French invention, but comes from France then into the way the Arthurian stories. So knights are going to be dedicated to a particular damsel, and they're going to be asked if they can have the immense privilege of wearing her favor, her sign as they joust, and then they maintain her honor against, all of that. So that whole courtly love, chivalry, heraldry, pageantry, which is a massive part of how people actually lived in the 13th and 14th centuries, was fueled by the immense popularity in courts, but not just in courts, all over, of stories of Arthur. And we know that from all kinds of evidence. I mean, the most striking one for me, because I'm also a great lover of Dante, is that, Dante talks about how Paolo and Francesca, the tragic lovers whom he meets in the Inferno, and actually were sitting in a garden reading about Lancelot and Guinevere. And that's kind of what kindled their love. So there was a flow back. Oh, for that matter, before he realized that God was calling him to be a saint, the kind of romantic bit inside of St. Francis, he read the Arthur stories and he wanted to be a knight at arms and ended up in a brief military skirmish and became a prisoner of war. And, so do you know what I mean? Anybody with a kind of sense of heart and adventure wanted to be part of that story. It was massively influential. And curiously enough, the one language it wasn't written in was English, because at that point, because of course Arthur was a Briton. Arthur was, one of the Celts whom the English had conquered, and that's one of the reasons why the Normans made a big deal out of him, because they'd conquered the English as well, and they couldn't really have epics about the English kings they just conquered without having rebellions on their hands. But if they went back behind the English to the Britons, Bretagne, Grand Bretagne, this is all French, Great Britain, and then Bretagne just itself, which is Brittany, and then between them is Cornwall. That was all great for them. So that became something that they celebrated. So in a sense, for a while, you might thought the English were kind of having fought the Welsh or the Celts, and now having been defeated by the Normans, were rather being squeezed from two sides. But eventually, the stories were too good not to tell.
Yeah.
So by the 14th century, you start getting English poets writing about it, specifically the anonymous Gawain poet, Gawain and the Green Knight.
Yeah.
And then there's a poet called Wace, who writes a long poetic version, but with extra material
Yeah.
based on Geoffrey. He's the one who says that Arthur dwelt among the elves. And then there's an anonymous alliterative
Yeah. Yeah.
data,
Yeah.
which has recently been translated by Simon Armitage.
Mm.
So yeah, there's a huge wealth of material. Now, from my perspective, the really interesting thing is what happens to that material.
Mm.
Geoffrey of Monmouth claims to be a chronicler. He's not particularly a person of deep spiritual sensibility, and we don't get the kind of Grail stories.
Mm.
But very soon we do. There's a French writer called Robert de Boron, and then there's various anonymous writers, and then there's the named Chrétien de Troyes, who introduced this theme of the Grail, which eventually is seen as the Holy Grail.
Mm.
And that's really interesting because that's coming from deeply from the world of Christian faith. And by the time you get to the fullest expressions of it and the creation of the character of Galahad, and especially that he's the unknown to Lancelot, he's Lancelot's son, that then becomes almost a kind of what happens when the very highest worldly standard, which is worldly culture, which is chivalry,
Yeah.
courtly love, what happens when that comes against the absolutely radical inbreaking of grace and the kingdom of God, which is represented by the Grail?
Yeah.
And the answer is that the worldly, great as it is not great enough, that it needs to be let go of, that it's broken in some ways, its flaws are exposed. And then a new dispensation has to come, which is grounded in the kingdom. And that's all there in the fact that Lancelot cannot achieve the Grail. He keeps getting close, but he kind of can't find a door to the chapel. And then when he goes through the chapel, he experiences the presence of God as a consuming fire and is sort of cast out of it. But Lancelot's son, who is actually conceived in sin, nevertheless becomes Lancelot can't do it because his mind is divided because of the affair with Guinevere, and also because of his worldly pride.
Mm.
He's the greatest knight, and he knows he's the greatest knight, and he doesn't care who knows it. And the writer of the Quest of the Sangreal, which is one of the texts that goes into Mallory and that I've also used in its original form, is really, it's almost like a test case. It's saying, what would happen if the thing that happens at church, where only the priests are, the laity didn't go, where the consecration happens, hoc est corpus meum, this is my body, this is my blood. What if that was suddenly arrived in the middle of the greatest of the secular courts, the court of Arthur? How would it cope? What flaws would it expose? What graces would it require? And that's really what the stories are partly about.
Yeah.
And obviously, it interests to me both as a priest and as a poet.
Yeah. And it's funny how even just reading these stories have reshaped my own view of that. Like on Sunday, I was teaching Sunday school and we're using leftover coloring pages at the end to fill in the time. And I realized it was like a picture of communion. And suddenly I'm like, oh, it's the Holy Grail. And that changed the way I colored it in or saw it or like.
Yeah, exactly. That's wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. So I feel like we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but my next question was what it meant to you personally to be taking up this tale.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it means a huge amount. Partly because I've known these stories since I was a very little boy, almost since before I could read, because my mother was a great storyteller as well as a person who could recite poetry, endlessly. She had a huge memory for these things. And also, I mean, that's the Scottish, if you like, that's the side of my strain. So there's something about these Celtic wonder stories and magic stories that appealed to both my mother, and I think through my mother appealed to me. She had read and absorbed Mallory, really Mallory, not some expurgated, or condensed version. And she would tell me these stories, and I would then hear them from my mother's knee, as it were. And then I had a little shield, you know, covered in cloth, and my mother had knitted me a sort of chain mail thing out of string painted silver. And I had a sword, you know, a wooden sword and everything. And I went around the garden playing. My sister didn't particularly want to play these games,
Oh.
so I played them by myself, you know, and I invented all the characters. And I realized quite early on, as I began to understand the different characters of the knights, that Lancelot was the kind of person who at school is captain of the rugby team and, you know, is top boy and all of that, and, you know, excels physically and everybody likes and everything. And I knew I was never going to be that boy. But Galahad, on the other hand, was somebody who kind of heard the elfin voices, who you know, went on these extraordinary quests, who could see and hear and feel more, and who had this particular calling to see and respond to the numinous. And even as a little boy, I always played at being Galahad rather than at being Lancelot. So I think, you know, when I first started to think I might be a poet, even then, so I'm talking about when I'm 16 or 17, it was not entirely from my mind that I might one day write an Arthur poem. In fact, about that age, I was reading T.H. White, but I was also reading Keats and Spenser. And I was reading Spenser because Keats had partly learned his art and craft as a poem by imitating Spenser. There's an early Keats work called Lines in Imitation of Spenser. So I decided I should learn the Spenserian stanza, which is a very delicate and difficult stanza to master, but I did. And I have written one poem that I've published in Spenserian stanzas. You know, it's about a spring walk, but it's called Out in the Elements. But as an exercise, just to teach myself how to do it, when I was 16 or 17, I mean, I don't possess this anymore, but I wrote up some of the T.H. White transformation scenes, particularly the one where they're turned into fish and they meet the pike.
Yeah.
I wrote an account of that in Spenserian stanzas
Cool.
as a 16, 17-year-old.
Yeah.
So I was already kind of trying it out. So I'd always had this. And then, you know, obviously I did lots of other things. And my main problem was how to do it. Of course, I wanted to do it in poetry, but there was no example of long narrative poetry really in the age in which I was living.
Yeah.
Though I could see that, you know, high modernist poets had touched on it. I mean, Eliot's poem "The Wasteland" is called after the motif of the wasteland in the Grail stories, and there are references, oblique references to the Fisher King and the Chapel of the Grail in the Wasteland. But the Welsh poet painter was the modern person that had come close to it in terms of high poetry or prose poetry. David Jones. So David Jones is in parenthesis and anathemata, and later on his The Sleeping Lord. So I was reading him, and then of course the other poet that really had taken it and run with it was Charles Williams. So by the time I was an undergraduate, I was reading Charles Williams. But the thing about Charles Williams and David Jones, indeed, is they're all high modernists. They're not writing easy reads. They're not writing actually for the general reader. They're writing extremely rare cherche poetry, consisting almost entirely of a network of hidden allusions. And they're kind of bristling with footnotes. And for a long time, I thought that was the only way you could go forward because I was living after these people. But at the same time, I thought that's not how I want to tell the story. It's too tricksy and modern and postmodern and self-referential, but I couldn't find a way out of that impasse. I thought at one point that I might take the phrase "the matter of Britain" and literally make it the matter, the physical matter of Britain, and write an Arthurian in which I walked round England and round and I gave a prose account of the modern journey. And then at each significant Arthurian place, I would evoke the place in poetry, and the piece of land itself, the land physically, the matter of Britain, would tell that bit of the story.
Yeah.
But the difficulty with that was it was again interrupting the narrative all the time. Just as you got to a bit in the Arthur story, you'd have another kind of dull episode of Malcolm Guite and a bread and breakfast, you know. Also, of course, there are multiple claims
Mm,
in various British places to the same
mm,
event or the same
mm,
place. You know, there are lots of candidates for Camelot and lots of candidates from the Battle of Camlan, and lots of candidates for the Lake of the Lady, lots of candidates for Avalon, for that matter.
mm, mm.
So I would have had to make a anyway. That had just left me stuck
Yeah.
with it. This is a thing I'll do vaguely when I can work out the form. Meantime, of course, I wrote my big book on Coleridge and was deeply
Mm,
immersed in the way Coleridge completely transforms the ballad form. But even then, I hadn't seen the obvious. And it wasn't until Rabbit Room wrote to me and said, look, we're doing this book called The Lost Tales of Galahad. Would you like to write a Galahad story for us in any form you like? I
mm.
don't think they knew anything about my Arthurian interests. I think I was just a poet they were interested in. So the day the email arrived, I was going to sit down and do the really hard, difficult work of going through my accounts and filling in a tax return form. So obviously I was desperate to procrastinate.
Yeah.
So I thought, I tell you what, I'll just do this. And I just hit on the ballad form. I thought, I know how the ballad form works. I can do it. And I
Yeah.
got completely absorbed in it. And in kind of 2 days, I wrote Galahad and the Naiad.
Mm.
And by the time I finished it, I realized I'd found my form.
Yeah.
This was the form. Because on the one hand, you could have all kinds of poetic effects, and it could be elusive to many other works.
Mm,
But on the other hand, a ballad is a good thumping meter into page turner. Plus, I had dreams already, which I've not given up, that
mm.
as well as existing as a book, and obviously I hope as an audiobook, that
Yes.
this poem could become, or parts of it at any rate, could become a series of live performances where people gathered round and it was really spoken out. So the
Yeah.
ballad form was incredibly good for that. Because again, Charles Williams, I like Charles Williams and I've learned a lot from Charles Williams,
Yeah.
but they're not sort of read along books, um, they're very, very dense and condensed, and you wouldn't get them at a single sitting. You'd have to have the book with you for ages before half of it started to dawn on you. And I didn't want that. I wanted
No.
something which certainly I hope will reward rereading, but I
Yeah.
wanted something that a mixed age gathering would be
Yeah.
enthralled. That's what I'm aiming for.
Yeah. And I wanted to, I guess I can follow up with more of my ballad questions. I think when we first met, you told me that my poem was a ballad, which I didn't actually know. So I would love to know more about what exactly makes a ballad, like technically.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, there's a thing called the common ballad meter. So ballads were originally sung or chanted, and they
Yeah.
were widespread, certainly in the British Isles,
Yeah.
essentially in a pre-literate age.
Yeah.
It was a way of telling a story that was memorable, and the person who was telling it could
Yeah.
memorize it easily, and the people who could hear it, who would get it, the person who, they
Mhm.
would, and they were common ballad tunes, and they were sung. And ballads were quite often, not that long, and they were very short, but they go right back to the 14th and 15th centuries. They were in France as well as in England.
Mm,
In France, the poet Villon refined it and turned it into a more
mm.
specific form called a ballade, which is rather distinct, the French tradition. But in Scotland, among the Lowland Scots, we're not talking about Celtic speaking Scots who had a very highly ornate
Mm,
series of poetic forms like the Welsh, but the ones who spoke what is now called Scots or Lowland or Doric sometimes had ballads. And these were all oral. Nobody wrote them down
mm,
until after the advent of slightly cheaper printing, in
mm,
the 60s. People started selling broadsheets, they were called.
mm,
So it's very cheap to produce, which had just one ballad on it.
mm,
And ballads by that time became a real way of sharing news. So there are loads of murder ballads and ballads about people being hung and ballads, political ballads and things like that. And essentially by that time it had found a form,
yeah.
which was usually a 4-line verse, but it could be
Mm,
longer.
yeah.
And alternating 4 stress and 3 stress. So 4 beats on the first line, 3 on the second,
Uh-huh.
and 4 on the third,
Yeah.
and 3 on the fourth.
Yeah.
And the only need only rhyme,
Uh-huh.
if you think of if you think of rhyme sounds as letters, So the end of the first sound is A, the end of the first one is B, and then you can have A, you can have another one which doesn't have to be A, it doesn't have to rhyme, as long as B rhymes. So you've got
Yeah.
4 lines in a traditional ballad with only 2 rhymes. There's sometimes you had internal rhymes. So if you just think of the, I mean, and within those stresses, you have a lot of freedom. So if you just think of the opening of The Ancient Mariner, where Coleridge is adapting a ballad for it is an ancient mariner. He stoppeth one of 3. See, that's the shorter line. By thy long grey beard and glittering eye. No rhyme there.
Oh,
Now, wherefore stops thou me?
yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
you know, so it's actually quite easy to write if you do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Now, what of course happened then was that people elaborated it,
Yeah.
and often ballads, you know, they did all kinds of internal rhymes with it. You know, the bridegroom's doors is open wide, and I am next of kin. The feast is set, the guests are met. You know,
Yeah.
mayst hear the merry din.
Yeah.
Do you see where
Yeah.
the unrhymed line, the feast cement, the guest is set, has an internal
Yeah.
rhyme. Use that. But then what Coleridge does is he takes that 4-line, 2-rhyme, strongly metered thing and actually opens it out and sometimes puts in a whole series of 3 or 4 internally rhyming lines before you get the payoff of the final rhyme. So it might go A, B, C, 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 A. You know,
Yeah. You're building up the suspense. I like to do that too.
you know,
Yeah.
and I do that a lot in
Yeah.
this version. The other thing about ballads is because they were originally an oral form, they have stock phrases and they have certain ways of putting things, and they often use repetition.
Yeah.
So if you think of the ballad of Sir Patrick Spence, which was the king sat in Dunfermline town drinking the blood red wine, but he'll say they had not gone a league, but barely 3. When the good Scots lords found the water to their knee or whatever, they had not gone a league, but barely 4. So you get this kind of repetition, but huge amount, and then lots of traditional, like, how many miles to Babylon? 80 miles and 10. Can I get there by candlelight? Yes, and back again. No rhyme of Babylon and candlelight, but so there's loads of, the same meter finds itself sometimes in nursery rhymes. And it was regarded, until Coleridge and Wordsworth took it up, it was regarded as a low form for peddlers and street sellers and not for high literary gentlemen. So part of the Romantic Revolution was to say, I'm going to take this and say it's great and use it. But the other person who was massively influential on the revival of ballads, and indeed the recording of them, was Sir Walter Scott, who was better known as a poet before he became a novelist. And he published in 3 volumes, I have the first edition of it, a thing called The Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border. And that had huge numbers of long ballads about the wars between the Scots and the English around the debatable lands around Northumberland. Brilliant. Then there was a great scholar called Child, his last name was Child, who produced the Oxford Book of Ballads. And those ballads became known as the Child Ballads because they were so popular and widespread. And many of the most famous ballads, and he has a whole section of ballads of magic and Celtic folklore. So, Thomas the Rhymer, for example. True Thomas lay on Huntley bank, and he espied a lady gay, a lady that was brisk and bold, come riding o'er the ferny brae. Her skirt was of the grass green silk, her mantle of the velvet fine. At ilka tet of her horse's mane hung 50 silver bells and 9. So she's the fairy queen, Thomas the Rhymer, harp and carp, come along with me, Thomas the Rhymer. And she takes him to fairyland. And then when eventually he returns, no time has passed at all. It's that motif. And, there's a wonderful moment where he's riding with her, where she says, and this became very famous in ballad, and I actually allude to this. I kind of quote it in one of my ballads in the Arthur series when Galahad meets an elfin knight. So she, the Queen of the Elves, she says, so see not yon broad road that lies across, I forget it was, but anyway, that's the road to hell, and there's loads of people on it. And see you not yon narrow road that like that run the fires. That is the road to heaven. Though few of it inquires. But then there's a third road. See you not yon bonny road that lies across the ferny brae. That is the road to fair elf land, where ye and I this night mun gae. So there's this third option, which is neither heaven nor hell, but is fair elfland. It's quite different, and that's where the ballad takes you. And there was once these things began to be printed in the 19th century and even more in the 20th century, they uncovered a whole cache of folklore, legend, and fairy tale. And since there are so many marvelous ballads in that sense, that was another reason why I felt the ballad form was appropriate for, as it were, something that's based on medieval romance, like the Arthurian.
Yeah, no, I definitely find it so. Trying to decide where to jump back in my questions now. I guess I wanted to ask about George MacDonald as the president of the George MacDonald Society. And yeah, I've been appreciating more now that I'm actually reading the King Arthur stuff, like the amount of the way that MacDonald engages with the King Arthur stories. And
Yeah.
yeah, I was curious of like if you your thoughts on how maybe MacDonald's view of those stories has like shaped your
Well,
own.
I mean, in a sense, we must both here kind of gesture towards the extraordinary scholarship and expertise of Kirsten Jeffrey
Yes, yes,
Johnson. So I read Fantastes, and obviously I'd noticed that he's reading a book about knights, and that later he
yeah,
meets the knight with the rusty armor. But I hadn't. It's just like one among many episodes. I hadn't really
yeah,
thought that. And then I think online, or maybe it was through the Rabbit Room or something, I did it. I kind of followed Kirsten's
yeah,
kind of guided reading of Fantastes,
yeah,
which was, I have to say, fantastic. I mean,
yes,
it was extraordinary. So she really makes the case that
yeah,
he is writing that book at the height of another burst of Arthurian enthusiasm.
mm,
All Arthuriana is going on, Tennyson has written The Lady of Shalott. He's in the midst of writing the Idylls of the King.
mm,
Swinburne is writing about Arthur. Lots of people are publishing shortened versions or expurgated versions of Malory.
mm,
And it's all aimed at the proper forming of the English gentleman, the upbringing of the English gentleman. And that partly goes back to Spencer's use of Arthurian things, where
mm,
he's again saying it's the formation of the perfect courtier. And MacDonald gets in on this act, but he
mm,
deliberately dedicates his book to young women and young men.
mm, mm,
And he's full on that there's Arthurian things here because they read the Arthur stories. And in fact, the knight with the rusty armor is Sir Percival. And he shows you in Arthur, in these nights, the possibility of letting your armor rust and go wrong, or the possibilities of
mm,
redemption. And
mm,
that's very much in the spirit of Malory anyway.
mm,
But he brings into these stories really a series of kind of wise women.
mm,
And at time and again, the ardent young man is getting it wrong
mm,
and has to come a cropper. And then a kind, wise woman comes and picks up the pieces and puts him back together again and teaches him some stuff he should have known in the first place.
mm,
And that's not just true of, say, a motherly, or indeed in MacDonald's case, a grandmotherly figure, but it's also true of the younger women. They have an active role. So I really thought if I'm going to introduce some figures like that. But
Mm.
then when I thought I don't have to introduce them. I just have to foreground them in a new way, because when you go back to the original sources, you know, Mallory says casually about a hermitess that they bump into as crucial information for Percival and Bors. You know, they're trying to find Galahad, they've lost Lancelot. She's got crucial information for them. They stay with her and rest up.
Yeah.
And Mallory casually says that she was Percival's aunt.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah.
like, why
Yeah.
is it? So you think, oh, wait a minute. The lady the beautiful holy maiden who eventually sacrifices her own life, who appears in the nick of time with Solomon's ship and picks up the Grail Knights, and without whom they would never have got to where they're going,
Yeah.
is Percival's sister.
Yeah.
So wait
Yeah.
a minute, what's going on here? Then so you try and read a bit of backstory on Percival, and you realize his father has been killed in knightly adventure. The two kids are brought up by their mother, but obviously there must be a sister, and that's a
Yeah.
classic thing, you know.
Yeah.
Single mum gets help from her sister. I totally get that. Um, and she's desperate for them not to even hear about knights or adventures, because that's how their father died. And that's part of the story of why Percival is so naive and thinks when he
Mm.
finally sees some knights in armor, he thinks they're angels. And that's part of the Percival story. But suddenly, here is his aunt showing up as a hermitess,
Yeah.
and his sister showing up as this inspired virgin who knows all about the Grail.
Yeah.
So, and is steering Solomon's ship.
Yeah.
Mallory doesn't even name her.
Yeah.
Fortunately, the earlier French sources do. She's called Andraine.
Oh,
So I
cool.
felt completely free, but I wouldn't have done this. I was inspired by MacDonald
Uh-huh.
to ask the question, how did his aunt, who
Mm.
must have helped his mother in bringing him up after his father's death,
Mm.
how did she end up as a mystic hermitess?
Mm.
And how did his sister end up as this inspired holy virgin out on an adventure?
Yeah.
Well, I thought there must be some connection.
Yeah.
After Percival runs away from home, his poor mother's only got the girl left.
Yeah.
But what if the aunt knew that the girl had a vocation too?
Yeah.
And what if it was a case of one older wise woman passing her knowledge on to another and
Yeah.
initiating her into a kind of Celtic mysticism?
Yeah.
Then I thought, well, in that case, Dandrain has just as much a Grail quest as Percival, and
Yeah.
neither would achieve what they achieve without their lost sister or brother.
Yeah.
So there's a whole story to tell here. And it was MacDonald that influenced me to do an entire section, in fact, of my Grail cycle called The Quest of Fair Dandrain,
Yeah.
which tells both the story of the aunt
Yeah.
and of the niece.
Yeah. Yeah. Broadening that perspective. I feel like that's hugely important. And
But I would want to maintain this is
yeah.
not me trying to drop some sort of
Mm.
21st century politically correct apparatus alienly into a story. It's
Mm.
all there in the story.
Yeah.
It actually just needed being foregrounded and teased out.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, oh yeah. So I also wanted to ask, as I was like enjoying the Arthur and the King Arthur and the Inklings book,
Oh yeah,
just
yeah.
the Inklings in general, or some of the other Inklings, how they may have also contributed to the way that they engaged with the King Arthur stories may have contributed to your view.
Well, of course, they all knew them incredibly well, but
Yeah.
particularly, obviously, Tolkien and Lewis, because they were medievalists.
Yeah.
So they knew all the source material. And Charles Williams had been obsessed with the stories
Yeah.
since he was very young, and
Yeah.
obviously, in the end, wrote the 2 volumes of poems that effectively are his own Arthurian cycle.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
Taliesin through Logres and in the region of the summer stars.
Mm.
Though he also wrote a Grail novel in a very curious transposed sense
Mm.
called War in Heaven. Williams, that is.
Mm.
We now know Tolkien wrote an unfinished Mort Data, which is quite close to the medieval alliterative Mort Data. So they all knew the stuff.
Mm.
I think they all recognized it as what they would call mythopoeic.
Yeah.
I think none of them were interested in trying to find and reconstruct a lost historical Arthur. The
Uh-huh.
point was not the mere events that might have triggered the legends, The point is the hidden truths, the deep, universal, mythic resonances of story itself. And that's very much my approach as well. A lot of what they did, of course, was consciously or unconsciously take and transmute Arthurian motifs into their work. I mean, Tolkien famously said he was trying to write a myth for the English. Now, he very much meant the English. And he thought, Arthur was a British in the old sense of the Britons rather than the English, the pre-Saxon invasion Britons. But nevertheless, of course, he's deeply so. So the point of, I mean, you can't write a whole section of your work, a whole third of your work called "The Return of the King," without being conscious of Arthur and the once and future king. And you can't feature swords that have been broken and then have to be put back together, and mythic swords that show that the king is the king, and have the story of a king who wanders and is not recognized as a king, but is eventually recognized as a king, partly because he's a wielder of Anduril, this ancient blade. So, there are clearly Arthurian motifs there. Lewis is very, again, controversial. I mean, the place where he most consciously, and I think deliberately, includes his Arthurian motifs is the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which he said was about the spiritual life, where it's a questing story. It's a journey in a special ship from island to island. It's looking for these lost lords, but it's ultimately coming to Aslan's table, and then into the Grail country itself, and in a beautiful transposition from the sublime to the perhaps equally sublime, but diminutive is if you ask who is the Galahad figure in this story, it's Reepicheep. Reepicheep. And where the fact that there's a picture of Reepicheep holding a chalice on Aslan's table,
Yes, I hadn't thought of that.
That's not for nothing.
Yeah.
And of course, the real point where he does it, and this is extraordinary, really,
Yes.
is one of the deepest and most important motifs in the Grail cycle.
Yeah.
Is what's called the dolorous blow, which is the what happens when the backstory of all of that, of course, is the journey of Joseph of Arimathea, the friend of Jesus, who lent his tomb to Jesus, who in legend is supposed to have brought the chalice, which is the Grail of the Last Supper, and the spear of Longinus, which is the spear that would the Roman soldier who's named Longinus wounded Christ with, which is obviously sacred, and it's still, as it were, permanently the blood of Christ flows from it. Sort of hangs above the chalice. Now, these are kept in the Grail Castle, and they're utterly sacred. But the disaster happens when a kind of untried knight called Balin, or Balin, some spellings Balin, comes from Arthur's court chasing an invisible knight. It's all kinds of shenanigans, but basically he's invited to a feast by the Grail King. Everybody's supposed to lay their weapons down. He keeps his weapon, but it breaks when he gets into a fight. So he's broken all the laws of hospitality, and it's the responsibility of the king to apprehend him. And the king runs after him, and they go through chamber after chamber, each one more kind of richly dight and holy. And but Balin, all Balin cares about is finding a weapon. And of course, eventually they come into the Hallows themselves, where the chalice and the spear are, and the spear is hovering in midair. And there's all kinds of voices saying, "Holy ground, take off your shoes for, don't come here, stand back, this is not for you," kind of thing. But he ignores them all. He grabs the spear, doesn't know anything about it. He just grabs the spear. He sees it only in a utilitarian way as a weapon, turns around and wounds his host. He wounds the king, who's an and at that moment, obviously, there's blood flows, complete darkness comes, there's an earthquake, the whole castle falls down around them. They remain buried under the rubble for 3 days, and eventually Merlin comes and digs them out. And he finds that by wounding the king, he's laid the whole land, the king's realm, to waste. It's the wasteland.
Yeah.
Because this utterly sacred thing has been perverted and abused, in the real meaning of the spear of Longinus and the wounding of Christ is really that nobody should ever have been wounded again thereafter, ever.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's a prophecy, of course, that this can be redressed, that when the Grail Knight comes, he will be of Joseph of Arimathea's line, like the Fisher King. He will take this, he will achieve the Grail, he will take the spear, and the same spear that wounded the king will heal him, and drops of blood will heal him. And then when he's healed, the land will be healed. That's the whole point of the story, right?
Yeah.
So the weapon with which Christ was slain is in the Hallows in the castle together with the goblet. Now, of course, what happens when they get to Ramandu's island and Aslan's table is that lying there on the table is a stone knife.
Yeah.
That is the knife that wounded out, that killed Aslan.
Yeah.
That is the Narnian equivalent of the spear of
Mm.
Long John. And
Mhm.
the reason why the guys have fallen asleep is that they
Yeah.
had a quarrel and one of them lifted up the knife, which is a thing forbidden to do. So
Mhm.
that's completely and carefully taken
Mhm.
from Arthur. And I think Lewis hoped that some of his older readers might get that. And it was a way of saying this is a Grail quest. This has always been part, this is the Narnian
Yeah.
Grail cycle.
Yeah. And that whether or not they get it, the power of the story, like,
Oh, yes, exactly the
yeah,
same motif.
yeah, yeah. It's like, yeah.
So it's the instrument of the passion. That's the point.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, of course, what unfortunately happened
Hmm.
at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, and this is something against which the Inklings, and especially Lewis
Hmm.
and William, stood out. What happened was that you got this attempt by an increasingly secular and humanistic society to do kind of anthropological explainings away of everything.
Hmm.
Everything is a fertility ritual or a primitive. And this was all done particularly in a book of comparative anthropology by a chap called Fraser called The Golden Bough, which was very, very widely read. And people began to apply that to the Arthur stories. And they basically said, oh, there's a very light Christian gloss here. It's got nothing to do with Christianity. The Celts had a cauldron of generation and they had the spear of Bron. And these are really old Celtic stories nicked by the Christians and given a quick bit of Christian polish, but they're really not about that at all, which is completely reading against the grain of the text. And then having said that, they could say it all goes back to pre-Christian pagan Celtic rituals to ensure the fertility of the crops. That's why there's the story about the king being wounded and all that. Do you know what I mean? Now, it's not that it's perfectly true that there are Celtic pagan elements,
Hmm.
but what the writers are consciously doing with that is the exact
Hmm.
opposite. They're saying these were always waiting for the Christian story to come into focus. They were
Hmm.
always about that. Now that. So the unfortunate thing was a woman called Jessie Weston wrote a book, very influential book, From Ritual to Romance, which is the book that influenced T.S. Eliot and from which he takes the term the wasteland.
Hmm.
This wasn't really Christian. It was a kind of primitive vegetative myth, as they called it. And kind of Eliot buys that, really. And
Hmm.
obviously he changes his mind once he becomes a Christian, but by the time he's writing The Wasteland, he's bought that. So Charles Williams was intending to write a whole book on the Arthur material called The Figure of Arthur,
Hmm.
just like his great book, The Figure of Beatrice, about Dante. But he didn't live to do it. But Lewis, subsequently after Williams's death, published it, the
Hmm.
fragment of it that exists,
Hmm.
under the title The Arthurian Torso, together with Lewis's own interpretations of Williams' poetry.
Hmm.
And in that, basically, Williams asserts and shows with strong literary evidence everywhere that this was all, the Holy Grail was always the chalice. It was all of Christ. It was always meant to be. But it brilliantly brought the other things in and transformed them. It baptized the pagan Celtic imagination rather than really. And that is the complete key to the way I approach the material.
Hmm. Yeah. I was thinking that kind of maybe leads more into a question I have later on about kind of just generally the fantastical or the numinous things that come up in this story is that some of them are fairyland and some of them are more obviously like
Mm.
spiritual Christian sense. And so my question was, yeah, how distinct are those from each other and what place do you feel like each has in the story or the relationship to each other even?
Can I just pause for a second because
Oh,
my
yeah, of
wife
course.
is calling?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, let's carry on.
Okay. Yeah, so thinking about in the fantastical area we have both like the fairyland aspects and the more like Christian spiritual aspects. And so I was just trying to even figure out in my own mind like how distinct they are from each other or the
Yeah,
relationship to each other and each like the place that each has in these stories.
yeah. Okay, so I think we have to get rid from our minds of it. We're almost more purist and Puritan than our forebears,
Right.
what things were
Yeah.
together. We have to, let's just start by the obvious fact that
Uh-huh.
all the great Greek and Roman myths and legends, let alone the history of Caesar, everything from the pagan classical world, some of the earliest manuscripts of that are only 11th century. They're copies of copies of copies. And who copied them? The monks copied them. The whole inheritance. People are, there's this stupid neo-pagan rhetoric about how we all had a groovy pagan time and then these wretched party-pooping Christians came and spoiled it all. It was actually the Christians who preserved it all and wrote it down.
Yeah.
And that was true as much of Celtic otherworldly legend and myth as it was of Greek and Roman.
Yeah.
So we have to start by admitting that the preservers of all this learning and storytelling were in fact Christians, and often Christian monks, who nevertheless, in their view of the world, had room for these stories. Now, they had different ideas about what they meant, and but they obviously didn't think there was any harm in them, in the sense that they didn't feel that it was improper to tell them. When you get the Arthurian stories, it's something new enters in. You don't have, on the one hand, here's a bunch of Celtic fairy tales. On the other hand, here's a treatise on the theology of Holy Communion. Two completely different genres. You're never going to mix them up. What happens in the Arthurian stories is a kind of supposal, as it were. What would happen if we brought these two stories together? How would they react with each other? You know, let's just bring them into the same world. And so you get these extraordinary things where, for example, quite early in Mallory, when you get to the famous episode of The Sword in the Stone, it's clearly magical. I mean, a stone appears out of nowhere. There's an anvil in the stone. There's a sword in it. Only one person can wield it. It's outside Westminster Abbey, and there's a learned conversation between Merlin on the one hand and the Archbishop of Canterbury. I mean, you couldn't be more specifically ecclesial about what they should do about the stone and how they should set guards on it and how they should bring all the knights, because the realm is in peril, because Arthur has died and there's no clear heir. I mean, in fact, Merlin knows perfectly well that there is a clear heir, and he'd spirited Arthur away precisely in order to stop him being murdered, you know, by the internecine squabbling, and keep him until his manhood, and then bring him in at the great moment to unite the kingdom again. That's the whole point of the story. But you think, well, the Archbishop of Canterbury, you know, who's presumably, you know, at this point a kind of Celtic Christian. I mean, of course, the Archbishopric of Canterbury wasn't established until Augustine came over to Canterbury in 597. So it would be at the very end of the Arthur period, if at all. But, you know, Mallory is not interested in the history. He's interested in the story. So there you have a meeting. Merlin is clearly some kind of druidical figure. He's a magician. You know, he in the story, it's claimed that he magically transported all the stones of Stonehenge from Ireland to Salisbury Plain. Now, obviously, they didn't know then, or even in Arthur's day, how old the stories were, how old the stones were. They're much, 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 much older than that. But they are, in fact, not from Ireland, but they're from Wales. And the oldest stone, it's only just been discovered, is from Strathclyde in Scotland.
Whoa.
So there was clearly a legend going, there was clearly a folk memory of their having been transported. And people could hardly think how it could be done. So,
Yes.
oh God. People could hardly imagine how it'd be done. So it's natural to imagine a magician doing it. So it is extraordinary. Now, what are we to make of it? I think, first of all, we should be glad that both elements are there and that they've been brought together.
Yeah.
I think we can go further than that. I think there's a theology available to us in the New Testament, which is a theology, if you like, of prefiguring and of God's anonymous presence. It's based on the idea that God is eternally Trinity and in omnipresent and everywhere. And if he is the one from whom all good thoughts, all just deeds, all holy counsels do proceed, then wherever there's been a good thought or a just deed, AD or BC, if you like, the full Trinity has made it possible. So the place where this is adumbrated, as it were, most clearly, is in the Acts of the Apostles, when Paul is in Athens at the Areopagus at the field of Hill of Mars, where he says, you know, men of Athens, I see in every way you are very religious. As I observed the objects of your worship, I saw this statue to an unknown God. Him whom you worship as unknown, him therefore I preach. So the one I'm telling you about, in a sense, is already there. But he doesn't say, oh, great, that's cool, groove on down with your idolatry. He doesn't say that. He says, but now you need to know that God doesn't actually live in statues, and but that he's bringing us, but he has finally revealed fully who he is in the person of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
But he doesn't, he starts by saying, in fact, he quotes pagan poets. He says, some of your own poets have said, in him we live and move and have our being. So God is already in ancient Athens before Paul gets there. But Paul has good news about how much more we can know about God in Jesus Christ. And the coming of Jesus, therefore, fulfills certain things that were already in the ancient culture, but it also judges certain things that were already in the culture. So they stop thinking that God is to be found in this one particular statue, right?
Yeah.
So that's a very interesting and integrative thing. Now, if that's the case, if we were to say that the Jewish people were given the Torah and the prophets to prepare and train them for Christ, and that Christ is constantly foreshadowed throughout the Old Testament and predicted, and if we were to say that the Greeks were given philosophy, and that their long theology of a logos, a word, a meaning underpinning everything, and eternal within the temporal, and all that, was preparing them for the gospel. And that's clearly the contention of the author of John's gospel, because he begins with a Greek philosophical proposition and says it's fulfilled and made flesh in Jesus. So if that's what happened with the Jews and the Greeks, then it's not unreasonable to ask, what about us? What about us northern barbarians and, pre-Christian Celts and all the rest of what we are? Was there nothing in our traditions and our stories and our magic and our elves and fays that was also getting the heart and mind ready to recognize Jesus when he came? Well, the answer is yes, there was. And in fact, the very thing that sort of Jesse Weston and George, Fraser said, oh, look, it's not really Christian, it's only pagan. The very fact that they noticed that there were certain pagan motifs that could be transformed utterly and yet still fulfill their meaning. So the cauldron of generation is this magic cauldron where you put a little bit into it and you can keep taking out of this cauldron everything you need, and you can feast a whole army. And also you can put the dead in it and they come back to life, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's not like this is a story about this cauldron, but I'm just meaninglessly going to call it the Holy Grail to get past the senses. That's ridiculous. No, he's saying, look, we were always knew there must be something which would be utterly life-giving, from which would feed a multitude. Now we hear about Jesus. He says, I am the bread of life. He comes to us in the Eucharist. And all those old stories have found their fulfillment. They were always about Jesus.
Yeah.
But if you really believe that, then you've got to bring the stories together. And if you're a really good storyteller, you don't keep interrupting the story with sermons and saying, now, please note that this is safely this, or you don't do that. You just let them come into the imagination together and see what happens.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. I guess, okay, so the next question that I have here is, so what sets your retelling apart from other retellings of the Arthuriad, and maybe connected to that, like how is it speaking directly to like the time that we're living in now?
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I mean, every retelling
Yeah.
obviously has to be faithful to the story, and you hope it's a
Yeah.
good story. But it is necessarily and rightly and properly of its own time. Because we, as one, where we are now, bring different questions, different expectations, different needs to the story. And if the story is great myth, then it will speak to those expectations and meet those needs and answer those questions. That's what great myth does. It's why we still tell these stories. Now, when Eliot wrote The Wasteland, insofar as he was touching on this material at all, it was because he felt the image of a land that had suddenly gone to waste and was of that dryness, that unfruitfulness, that barrenness, spoke to him of the awful situation between the two wars after the devastation of the First World War, after the destruction of all the hopes of progress, after the Spanish flu, which was much worse than our pandemic and killed millions. This image of a desolate land was important to him, and he clearly is drawing on that because he's writing a poem, The Wasteland, about the anomie and disconnection and malaise that immediate post-war period. Now, when my mother first told me the story of the Dolorous Blow and the utter devastation, and the fact that after he's pulled out from the rubble, Balin has to ride, the man who's done this deed, through the land and see the devastation. And there are people standing, starving at their doorways, cursing him as he goes past, and sees the fish dead in the rivers, and he sees the crops rotting in the ground, and he knows, I did this. Yeah. And I remember my mum telling me this story. I was about 8, and I said, that's awful. How could it be? How could one man, how could there ever be a world in which one man could do so much devastation? And my mother said to me, well, we live in a world like that. And this was in the 60s, obviously, she was telling me this. The threat of nuclear annihilation was there. She was reading that to me after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the whole world. So she was offering me an interpretation, saying, you live in a dangerous world. What everybody does counts for everybody else. She was trying to teach me, and she was trying to be realistic to me about the world into which she brought me, but she was also trying to teach me that everything that everybody does matters, and I learned that. So that's what it meant to me as I was growing up, because that's what my mother had showed it meant to me. But by the time I came to write my Arthurian, I had another sense of what the wasteland is. And that was the total, the brutal view of the world that we have in a pure materialism, the kind of mechanization of the world, what we would call the disenchantment of the world. So no longer is it full of life and beauty and love. It's just an agglomeration of stuff. It's just the unwinding of itself. What we can broadly call reductivism, which is the consequence of the Enlightenment and the characteristic of modern Western thought. Now, we are just beginning to experience a rebellion against that. And there are many writers, and not just Christian writers, calling for what they call the re-enchantment of the world. Now, I don't think the world needs to be, I think the world is already enchanted. It's just we're disenchanted. We need to enter into again in the enchantment of the world. So in my telling of the wasteland, I imagine what it would be like for knights who lived in a much more participative, the kind of world that Owen Barfield describes as original participation, for whom every breath was the breath of God, every wind was the breath of God, there was a immediate vivid connection between the stars and the sky and your own eyes, between the flowing streams and the blood in your veins. There was a microcosm and the macrocosm. They completely, and everything had life and character, and you would expect there to be dryads and naiads, because a tree must be so much more than just the outer person of the tree, all of that. So my lights are living in that world constantly. That's why they can see the Lady of the Lake, and it's where. But what would happen if for a moment they were plunged into the modern reductive materialist view, that any truth or meaning is private and subjective, and all we see is islanded in the isolated concavity of our skulls, and out there it's just dead stuff. Supposing they went from that living participative for a moment into our worldview, they would be utterly devastated. Of course, they would call it the wasteland. They would be suicidal. So that's what I do when my guys go through the wasteland. They suddenly lose all their connectivity. And I'm hoping to shock my modern reader, because I've given them, by this time, a couple of books of the fully numinous, integrated, utterly enchanted world. I've been spending my whole time assiduously re-enchanting them. That's my project. And then I say, now, just a minute. The world you thought was normal before you started reading my poem is incredibly abnormal. And to show you how abnormal it is, I'm going to put these 3 knights you've been following into the world the way we see it, or used to see it. And you'll just see how abhorrent it is. And you'll long for the wasteland to be healed. And in fact, part of the purpose of my poem is not so much to describe the story of the wasteland and its healing, but I'm actually interested in healing the wasteland. I mean, the wasteland that we're now.
Yeah.
I have a serious agenda of re-enchantment, which I
Yeah.
think was fully carried out in its own, or was part of, you know, that's what the Inklings were doing. They
Yeah.
were re-enchanting the world. And that's why their books have lasted, because we desperately need it.
Yeah.
So that's the meaning of the story of the wasteland and its healing. It's a parable for me now
Yeah.
of what we lost in Enlightenment and modernism and how it can be restored. Now, that's not what my mother told me, and it's not what T.S. Eliot, well, it's slightly nearer to what T.S. Eliot thought, actually, but do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So I'm upfront about this in a sense. Obviously, in the story, I just do it as a story. There's no footnotes, but
Yeah.
I have on the model of Tolkien doing the appendices at the end of the Lord of the Rings. I've got a series of appendices at the end of each of my volumes,
Yeah.
and I've got a whole appendix on the wasteland, which sets all that stuff out, and
Yeah.
also talks more length about T.S. Eliot's wasteland.
That's amazing. Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to that. Um, the next question I had was if about I feel like I've heard mentioned that you were visiting, like you even mentioned earlier, visiting the physical locations that are kind of associated with
Hmm.
Arthur stories. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I was curious about that or any
Well, I visited some of them, but not. I've made several trips to Wales where
yeah,
I've get all of the stuff.
yeah.
I've obviously been to Winchester. In fact, I'm invited to speak at Winchester, where allegedly the Round Table is.
Oh
What's
yeah.
missing from my agendas, and I've been to Glastonbury many times, and that's in a sense a central place. But the other place is Tintagel in Cornwall, where
Yeah.
I will be going next year and spending some time. In that sense, I'm following in Tennyson's footsteps because he
Okay.
did the same. He was writing his Arthurian stuff.
Yeah. Do you find like in the places that you have seen already that that kind of works its way into your view of the story or in how you tell it?
Yes, to some degree. I rather wish it would work its way in more. I need some more. I've abandoned the original idea of just walking all over and writing a
Yeah.
double there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I need some more specific. There are not very many place names part in the poem so far, partly because it's a bit difficult to know where the places were.
Yeah.
But I need to work some more of that in. Probably in the final revision, I'll do a bit more of
Mm.
that.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Maybe to give you an idea
Yeah.
of the enchanted world as I want you to see it. I mean, I've got a whole account of this enchantment, but and also just to illustrate what I said about Dandrain and the wise woman. And I've got a bit where she's teaching the kind of lovely sort of Celtic hermit prayer style,
Yeah.
and she's teaching Dandrain to pray. And
I'm wondering if something's on your microphone. Suddenly I couldn't hear you quite as well.
oh right, no, I mean
Oh,
unless
that's
it was
better.
just
Yeah.
uh, something's funny on your microphone actually. It's
Oh, or maybe it's
only
just the connection then, or
okay, okay.
okay.
So so just read you a couple of verses.
Okay.
Go to her hermit's cell in the wood. She taught Dundrain the way of prayer, the way to still her soul, the way to woo each beast and bird, and know each creature as a word breathed into being by our Lord. For God himself is the true bard, and sings creation through his word. And Dandrain learned from all she heard, and knew each star, each stone, each bird, as parts of one great whole. By night she kept pure vigil there, and morning came too soon. For
Mm,
she would see the stars wheel by, and hear their music from on high, and
mm,
feel their influence, and cry in ecstasy when she'd descry a sphere of silver light draw nigh. Then she would lift her eyes and spy above the valley's chalice high the wafer of the moon.
yeah.
So that's a way of seeing nature.
Yeah. 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 No, that's amazing. Um, oh yeah, I guess I wanted to ask something you'd mentioned I think in a Spell in the Library video was about the Grail quest being the story of the inner life as well as outer legend, and I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's part of the way myth
Mm.
works
Yeah.
is that the outer story out there and back then
Mm,
helps us to articulate in a different way what's happening in here and right now.
mm, mm,
Um, to some degree, the quest for the Grail is an analogy with the pilgrimage of the Christian life.
mm.
is that the Grail comes to them when they're not expecting it, in the midst of a feast, in Camelot,
Mm,
and it's veiled,
mm,
and they all are drawn to it in different ways. It gives them, for a moment, a wonderful experience, wonderful secular experience. They all have exactly what they'd like to eat and drink,
yeah.
and they there's beautiful music and the great fragrance, of heaven, and the music fills. They get a sense of completely redeemed, and then the Grail disappears, but they don't see the Grail itself. They see it through a veil of white samite, or they don't see it, they see the veil, but they know that's the source of everything that's come to them. So their quest is really to find out the source from which this sudden moment of blessing came.
Mm,
And it turns out that trying to do that, even though they've been given beauty and plenty as a kind of foretaste of the banquet of heaven,
mm,
the actual journey to the banquet of heaven does not, unfortunately, consist entirely of banquets, much as one
mm,
might like it
mm,
to. That actually, there are vigils, there's fasting, there's prayer, there are disappointments, there are false allurements to deal with. There are various distractions on the way,
yeah.
and as one is about to lose the path, one keeps getting called. And eventually you can't get to the Grail castle where the Grail is unless you go through the wasteland, because the castle is surrounded by the wasteland, because
Yeah.
it's the lands of the king of the Grail castle that have been laid waste. So just before you get to the best bit, if you like,
Mm, mm,
you have to go through the worst bit.
mm, mm,
And it's such an experience of devastation that you don't know if you're going to make it through.
yeah.
Now, all of those things, every single one of them, are true of the spiritual life. Anybody who's had a rapturous conversion
Mm,
will find their faith joyful and easy at first.
mm,
And then there will come a point, Lewis writes about this all the time, where there is, in fact, a deliberate withdrawal,
mm,
where you have to keep going on faith and trust. You don't get the rewards. Your prayer life is dry.
mm,
You feel tempted and taunted. And
mm,
you have to discover your commitment. It has to move from the affections to the will.
mm,
But the will is the deepest part of yourself. That's what Jesus needs. That's what you need to give to him. And so you go through periods of trial and temptation and difficulty. And you're sustained by that first vision you had, and by
mm,
the conviction that that first vision comes from somewhere else.
mm,
You can't just keep going back to Camelot and hoping that the same moment will happen again. Even though it happened at Camelot, you
mhm,
actually have to move on
mm.
from Camelot and eventually find the Grail Castle. And those things are all true of the spiritual life.
Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing. Um, another
I'll have to
question.
stop fairly soon because I've got to go and rescue
Oh,
the cat.
yes. Yes. Yeah, let me, whatever your timing is. I definitely, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, because it has been an hour and a half. I just realized looking at the time. Yeah. Um, yeah, I was curious about like the role of like nature, and especially like humanity's relationship with nature. I feel like that's significant in a lot of Arthur's stories and yours.
Yeah,
And
well, of course, some of that I've already spoken of in the kind of the wasteland and
yeah.
orient. I mean, part of that is the recognition that in the earlier pre-modern view of nature,
Mm,
nature is anima, it's
mm,
animated, it's
mm,
soul.
mm,
And there are the classical people, but also the Celtic people,
mm,
naturally saw, as it were, a sense of particular consciousness and personhood in all the parts of nature.
mm,
So it's natural to have a naiad in the
mm,
water,
mm,
or a lady of the lake,
mm,
or somebody who could, as it were, be the water itself. Of the water, the flowing water of the lake is one of her manifestations. She is more than that. The
mm,
lake is, as it were, to her what our clothes or our body might be, you know,
mm,
but it is inhabited, it is personified. So that's the way you see nature, and you keep meeting these
mm,
characters who are clearly
mm,
personifications. But
mm,
it's not quite right to use the word personification. Personification sounds like it's just dull matter, and we
mm,
chose to impose a person on it.
mm,
I think it's much more the case it really is a person, and we've chosen to pretend it's dull matter,
mm,
as though you were to come to a party in a particularly beautiful dress, and I
mm.
spent my whole time talking to your dress instead of to you. I
Right.
mean, that was annoying after a while. You,
Yeah.
you might like the compliments paid, but you might prefer that the person was talked to.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're doing with nature. We're not addressing it properly. We're just
Oh.
concerned with the material substance of it. And that's where the older traditions and the shamanic traditions and the First Nations and all of those know much better than we do
Mhm.
how to relate to nature. And that's why they haven't destroyed it in the way that we're destroying it.
Mhm.
Because as soon as you think it's dead stuff, you start exploiting it.
Mhm.
So I'm really calling for I mean, probably more than some of my would make some of my Christian confreres comfortable, but I really am calling for a personal re-engagement with nature as a series of fellow creatures
Mhm.
rather than as dead stuff that we are Lord and Master over.
Yeah.
I want a courtesy to return, a
Yeah.
mutuality in our relations with nature. And I see that everywhere exemplified, both in good practice and in bad practice.
Mhm.
So there's a whole thing that some knights have been poisoning wells, but also that they've outraged the nymphs of the wells, that they've been
Mhm.
sexually predatory. As a result of which, of course, they've simply withdrawn the waters, and
Mhm.
the lands are barren. And a kind of an apology has to be made.
Mhm.
Restitution and restoration has to be made. Good,
Mhm.
courteous relations with the springs have to be restored. And
Mhm.
that's as much a Christian act as it might once have been a pagan act.
Mhm.
And of course, C.S. Lewis is all over this. So
Mhm.
in Prince Caspian, when Aslan, when the liberation of the Narnians from the Telmarines, you know, the river god appears, Dionysus appears, naiads and dryads appear, and they're all romping away with Aslan. There's no problem there. Once you know that Aslan is Aslan, you're in
Mhm.
no danger of actually worshipping these. It may
Mhm.
have been in the past that these figures, who are the persons of nature,
Mhm. Mhm.
were once mistaken for gods and goddesses. And
Mhm.
maybe, you know, there was a time when Christians had to say, don't go back to the grave and worship.
Mhm.
But we're way past that time now.
Mhm.
Now we need to say, go back and be courteous.
Mhm.
You've got no danger of mistaking this piece of nature for God. You
Mhm.
might treat it decently as a sister or a brother.
Yeah. Yeah. There's sort of the lie that you could be more courteous to humans by being less courteous to nature,
Yeah,
but you actually are more courteous to everyone. There's not like a yeah,
yeah,
there's not
exactly.
like a limited amount of
Obviously,
courtesy.
some saints just got that instantly. I mean, St.
Yeah.
Francis knew that from the get-go, that, you
Yeah.
know, brother, sun, sister, moon, you know, mother, sister, earth. Yeah. I mean, we need that language to return, essentially. That's
Mhm.
part of what enchantment means.
Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing. How are you for time? I have a few
I should
questions,
probably
but
go in
I've got
about 5 minutes or so.
yes. Hmm?
I should go in about 5 minutes or so.
Okay. Okay. So I would just maybe close then with I wanted to ask more about your understanding of what it means to be a knight, like maybe even tying in with like the servant aspect or the
Yeah, well,
pursuit
exactly. I
of
think
glory
again
versus
we can talk to Kirsten
yeah.
about this.
Yeah.
Knecht, knight in the
Yeah.
Middle English pronounced Knechte, is
Mhm.
cognate with the German Knechte, which
Mhm.
is a servant. So,
Mhm.
although a knight is a very lordly title, in fact, they're meant to be a servant. And that's a very Christian reading of lordship, of course, because
Yeah.
I am come among you as one who serves.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, the whole idea of the knight as somebody who, although they have high rank and they ride a horse and they have a squire and all of that, sees themselves as at the service of the weak. And this is a
Mhm.
particular feature of Camelot. There's a thing
Mhm.
which is referred to as the Pentecostal oath, because it
Mhm.
happens at the Feast of Pentecost, that every year at Pentecost, the knights gather and they retell their adventures, but they renew their oath. And their
Mhm.
oath is an oath which has these things that they will not despoil or exploit or rob, that they will never harm a lady and so on, but also that they will defend the helpless and the poor, and particularly
Mhm.
women. That's in a society where women were particularly prey
Mhm.
to sexual violence. So, and in the past, it would have been strong men at arms who rode horses and had spears who would have been doing the sexual violence. And you still get traces of these. You see blackguard knights, you know, navally knights trying to do that, and the Christian knights, the Arthurian knights, ride to the rescue.
Mhm.
So it's kind of instilling an idea of service in people who, in a military society, arms bearing horsemen were
Mhm.
the people who naturally had mastery, and
Mhm.
they are precisely the people you need to have as an ethic of service. It's
Mhm.
summed up in a phrase that we use in English. I don't know if it's done in Canada or America, which is noblesse oblige.
Mhm. Mhm.
The noblesse oblige is if you happen to be one of the noblesse, whether you in
Mhm.
fact have noble blood or whether you've just had the privilege
Mhm.
of a secure upbringing and a fine education,
Mhm.
that carries an obligation
Mhm,
to put what you have at the service of others.
mhm.
And that's essentially part of the code of chivalry.
Yeah. Also Spider-Man's motto, like with great power comes great
Great
responsibility.
responsibility. Well, that's
But
exactly
it all
that.
carries down from this. I love seeing
Yeah,
how,
absolutely. That
yeah,
these superheroes are simply
yeah,
variations of Arthurian
exactly.
knights going on adventure.
There's so much in common I've noticed. I like comic books a lot, and I've noticed so many. Or even in Jane Austen, the novel Emma, how she's dealing with knightliness. Like the hero is George
Yeah,
Knightley,
Mr. Knight.
and
Yeah,
she's
Mr.
just talking
Knightley.
about,
Yeah,
yeah. There's so much about what it actually means to be a true servant and person to others in that echoes aspects of chivalry and that I hadn't realized before.
yeah.